Hey everybody, this is an article from Telos, 1981, issue 48. It's by Adolph Reed Jr. It's titled Narcissistic Politics in Atlanta. Okay, here we go. Atlanta has recently become a focal point of national and international attention because of a mysterious series of murders of local black children. Reporters have come from around the world to visit, and visitors to the city immediately press Atlantans for news, inside dope, or the latest updates as they express their sympathy and solidarity. The sentiments no doubt are genuine, and the outpouring of befuddled, curious concern is understandable, especially given the apparent senselessness of the killings. However, this phenomenon has another side beyond the personal and collective tragedy of the murders themselves. Indeed, the Atlanta child murders can serve as a micrological window on several important trends in contemporary American life. These tendencies can be illuminated by discussing four discrete but related themes. The issues are: 1. The increasingly consolidated stratification of the black community and the growing subordination of those African American strata who exist as clients of the social administrative apparatus. 2. The disqualification of the American mass public from interpreting and organizing its own experiences, and the emergence of the therapeutic professions and their ideologies in legitimating and reinforcing that disqualification. 3. The rise of homosexuality as a political stance and militant social agenda that exposes the moral bankruptcy of protest pluralism to the contradiction between a sexualized definition of political liberation and the exploitation of class weakness. And 4. The inadequacy of the contemporary left as a source of critical vision and the Reagan administration's intensification of social insecurity. Even prior to Reagan's announcement of his new program of regressive income transfer, the situation among his country's urban poor had been deteriorating, and Atlanta is a case in point. In Atlanta, the gap between median income earned and the poorest and richest census tracts widened significantly between 1960 and 1980. Footnote: these figures are taken by an analysis of poverty in Atlanta conducted by the City of Atlanta in connection with the Mayor's Action Conference on Poverty in Atlanta. End footnote. That trend gains more importance when one realizes A. that the poorest tracts are 93% black and the richest are 97% white, and B. that the 1960s were a period when segregation and institutionalized job and pay discrimination were unchallenged in Atlanta. Yet to completely fill out the general social context in which the Atlanta events are enveloped, the following phenomena should be noted. 1. The highly visible, much discussed, and grossly exaggerated growth of the black elite since the 1960s civil rights movement in general, and its impact on recruiting black public officials in particular. 2. The circumstance that race has functioned rather like a form of capital for much of this elite with which it can leverage claims for status, power, and income. 3. The insecurity engendered among this stratum as the stock exchange for its racial capital, the affirmative action apparatus, is threatened by Reagan's supply-side ideologies. 4. The local political arrangement in Atlanta that allowed the Chamber of Commerce to govern the city directly for a generation, with little mediation and no opposition, not even from the subordinated black elite, and in which the reigning business elite, spearheaded by real estate developers dependent on public funds, has remained ambivalent to the black political regime ushered in nearly 8 years ago. 5. A local Sunbelt boom economy whose growth is a post-World War II phenomenon based first on transportation and warehousing, then increasingly on paperwork industries and the convention trade, in which the labor market is divided between relatively high-paying paper-pushing jobs and very low-paying, quote, service sector jobs. And 6. A racial demography approximately the model of the small southern town, in which the railroad tracks separate the overwhelmingly black territory of South Atlanta from the overwhelmingly white one of North Atlanta. These are the salient environmental features in which the child murders have taken on the guise of a cruel farce. Footnote, and these are footnotes that I missed. This is a footnote that I missed. Floyd Hunter's 2 studies of Atlanta instructively trace local power and decision-making, always winding up at the door of the Chamber of Commerce. See Hunter, Community Power Structure, published in 1953, and his update, Community Power Succession, published in 1980. For a review from within, see Ivan Allen Jr., Mayor, Notes on the 60s, published in 1971. End footnote. Much has been made by various interested parties, the trendy national press, community activists, aspiring populist politicos, of the circumstance that a year or more passed and several children were killed under apparently similar conditions before local authorities decided to take special measures, only after much of the citizenry already had suspected a pattern linking a number of the murders. The lag can be attributed with good reason to the class background of the affected children. This problematic interpretation, however, glosses over the immediate cleavages within the black community and substitutes a simplistic Manichaean view held by the black elite, which can be easily refuted. Those sympathetic to the administrative apparatus's view that criticizes this black elite for selling out their people tend to assert that the lag in systematic police response express a malevolent insensitivity to the non-privileged strata of the black population. This interpretation has been particularly attractive to protest activist types whose knee-jerk response was to denounce the racism of the local power structure for the lag in police mobilization. The racism thesis in this case, however, collapses given Atlanta's black mayor, black city council majority, and the black police chief. Even though racism has been replaced by the elite insensitivity as a cause for the slow official response to the problem, the malevolence typically ascribed to racist motives continues to be implied as a basis for the black elite's perceived insensitivity. Not only is it unreasonable to suggest that black city officials are unsympathetic, but the activists need to adduce evil motivations to explain the black officials' actions indicates the confusion that surrounds discussions of the black elite in general. Stratification in the black community is anomalous in the ideological framework of black activism. Despite its often militant rhetoric, the critical horizons of such activism are circumscribed by the outlook and social strategies of pluralist liberalism. Hence, in the activist purview, the black community must appear in principle as a unified public bound by common interests. The black public officials, whose office holding is a result of that same pluralist activism, share this outlook. The predictable tendency, in turn, is for these public officials to universalize their personal and collective interests as those of the entire black population. Thus, for both public officials and activists, any differentiation of black interest takes on an aura of improbity or treason. An aura of improbity or treason. In this context, the rules dictate glossing over and suppressing manifestations of stratification. When situations occur that demand acknowledgement of stratification, such as the case of the murdered and missing children, any behavior that represents the non-collective interest is regarded as an evil deviation and demonic, rather than simply self-interested motives are imputed to the deviants. Of course, there is a connection between the stratification of the black population and the lag in police response to the killings. The connection, however, is not as simple as proponents of a sellout view of black class differentiation have argued. Rather, the connection emerges at the nexus of pluralist urban politics and local bureaucratic decision-making in Atlanta. In the absence of direct public pressure, patterns of urban service provision tend to follow inertially along courses largely determined by bureaucratic decisions. The victims in Atlanta have come from the most dispossessed sector of the city's population, the stratum of clients of the social welfare apparatus. In this stratum, life most nearly approximates the totally administered society, and its members are least likely to make any demands of the social administrative system. As the number of the murdered children grew, a pattern seemed to emerge. Yet since no demand came initially from the affected parents and communities, no significant pressure existed to reallocate police resources to an investigation of the killings. Only after the murder of Yusef Bell and the pressure mounted by his mother, who was an articulate and relatively well-educated person, was a special police task force a special police task force formed to investigate the cases. I looked up Yusef Bell, and I didn't find anything. But this whole paper's been referring to the Atlanta murders of what Wikipedia says are the Atlanta murders of 1979 to 1981. The Atlanta murders of 1979 to 1981, sometimes called the Atlanta child murders, are a series of murders committed in Atlanta, Georgia, between July 1979 and May 1981. Over the 2-year period, at least 28 African American children, adolescents, and adults were killed. Wayne Williams, an Atlanta native who was 23 years old at the time of the last murder, was arrested, tried and convicted of 2 of the adult murders, and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. Police subsequently have attributed a number of the child murders to Williams, although he has not been charged in any of those cases, and Williams himself maintains his innocence, notwithstanding the fact that the specific style and manner of the killings, which was by chokehold strangulation, ceased after his arrest. In March 2019, the Atlanta police, under the order of Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, reopened the case in hopes that new technology will lead to a conviction for the murders that were never resolved. As of April 2025, no results have been made public. Okay. So, back to the text. Anyway, continuing on. If the children had disappeared from more affluent or socioeconomically mixed areas, community pressure would have been brought to bear much sooner on city officials to take extraordinary action. This would have happened if only because the black city officials live in such neighborhoods and would have greater contact with the affected families and concerned parents. As it stands, however, the victimized neighborhoods are almost uniformly those housing the poorest elements of the black welfare community. Therefore, even among the attentive black public, this problem remained posed in the third person, which did not mobilize political activism. Such mass quietism reflects the differentiation of the black population, not only along lines of socioeconomic status, but also of political aggressiveness and activism. When coupled with the black elite's tendency to understand and protect its agenda ideologically, as that of the entire black population, the tendency among the most dispossessed to not challenge the social, administrative apparatus does not bode well for protecting the interest of this increasingly isolated and administered client population. Yet another, more subtle theme in the child murders also discloses the significance of black stratification. Once the case had become designated officially as a general public concern, therapeutic professional groups began an intense campaign to clinicize any discussion of and all responses to the problem in order to consolidate a role for themselves in managing this administratively defined crisis. Social workers, child psychologists, psychiatrists, as well as various public and private therapeutic functionaries began expostulating the emotional ramifications of the allegedly existent but as yet undocumented problem of, quote, increasing fear among Atlanta's children. Footnote. What appears to be the only empirical statement on the magnitude of this purported emotional crisis was made in early April 1981 by a high functionary of the Atlanta Board of Education, Barbara Whitaker, speaking on a late-night television program devoted to the problem, informed listeners that no increase in referrals to counseling had been reported by school personnel. Even though Whitaker alluded to the possibility of some unspecified other indicators of increased emotional instability, the one concrete datum she marshaled tends to refute the therapeutic line. End footnote. Not only is the existence of this problem proclaimed without any substantive justification, which presumably should violate some canon of professional method, but developments in the murder cases indicate that the children purportedly paralyzed by fear are not those who are actually in danger. Plainclothes police conducted an experiment in the most affected areas in which young males fitting the general profile of the victims were enticed to enter strangers' cares with offers of money. Each child approached would enter the car for $10. Cars. Typo. Were enticed to enter strangers' cars with offers of money. Each child approached would enter the car for $10. Footnote. Both therapeutic functionaries and political officials have revealed their own ideological commitments by taking care to emphasize that the kids were enticed with offers to earn rather than beg money, as if misery is somehow ennobled by the work ethic. End footnote. Given that many of the children were last seen in daylight hours and that one was last seen hawking merchandise at a shopping center, the results of the experiment indicate that the victims were not taken forcibly from the streets. Rather, they were lured, almost certainly by money, to accompany their killer voluntarily. Those children who have the most to fear, therefore, hardly seem paralyzed by fear. On the contrary, the exaggerated self-reliance common among so-called street kids contributes to their vulnerability. Moreover, in light of the previous considerations of the social administrative apparatus, reports of emotional trauma are far more likely to be experienced among upper-income and more highly educated sectors of the population, whose children are relatively safer anyway since they are not susceptible to the lure of a few dollars. Footnote. One might wonder whether the black elite has not done its children a disservice in this case through its ideological disposition not to see distinction in the black community. End footnote. This mobilization of the therapeutic cadre, then, undoubtedly rises from within the black elite itself. Apparently, the fears of this elite have generated a legitimizing demand for therapeutic professional services, whose providers, of course, are highly visible among the black elite itself. Yet more than legitimation is at stake here. Of the initial $979,000 federal grant to Atlanta in connection with the missing and murdered children, the greatest proportion was designated for mental health counseling and related programs. Furthermore, in early April, Health and Human Services Secretary Richard S. Schweiker granted the city an additional $304,000 for mental health-related programs to combat emotional trauma. Thus, once again, the welfare state apparatus rationalizes corporate capitalism's propensity for turning someone else's tragedy into the raw material for profit. Footnote. Naturally, the therapeutic professionals are not alone in this enterprise. In addition to several very ordinary con men who have been arrested for unauthorized solicitation of funds, the local ABC affiliate has taken a cue from its network's ratings coup during the Iranian hostage spectacle and has added a nightly program after the late news on the, quote, crisis of our children, end quote, or some such theme. The program has been a showcase for therapeutic ideologues. Moreover, community activist careers have taken on a new vitality and visibility, and the victimization of impoverished children has given hints of opening activist or community service functionary career possibilities for certain of the more articulate clients of the welfare state apparatus. End footnote. The ease with which therapeutic functionaries have been able to establish their agenda or services also indicates the convergence of the larger dynamic of personal disqualification. The progressive extension of the therapeutic mode as a vehicle for mass subordination and the general spread of a narcissist outlook through American culture. The general disqualification of individuals from becoming competent to understand, organize, and direct their own daily lives in the increasingly fragmented mass capitalist marketplace is buttressed by the assertive state apparatus as it usurps competing authority structures such as the family. In Atlanta, the state has legislatively restricted juveniles' rights of movement, both via curfew laws and an ordinance curtailing peddling activity by minors. The curfew raises strong questions of constitutionality inasmuch as it provides that parents can be held culpable and punished for their children's violations. However, both ordinances set up City Hall as the legitimate arbiter for determining appropriate child-rearing behavior in circumstances that do not clearly warrant such intervention. Footnote. Clear and present danger does not seem to be a sufficient justification in this case, since there is no indication that a curfew is any deterrent to the killings. End footnote. Moreover, it is clear that both ordinances basically are class legislation. As a practical matter, the only children enjoined from peddling are those who need to peddle. The only children and parents subject to enforcement of the curfew are those without other suitable entertainments. In this regard, it is instructive that one of the strongest supporters of the present curfew legislation is a city council member who introduced similar legislation in 1978 in response to the Chamber of Commerce's concerns that the central business district was overpopulated at night by unoccupied black juveniles whose presence was offensive to conventioneers. Footnote. The council member in question is black and leads feckless searches for bodies and clues. The council member who produced and militantly defends the anti-peddling ordinance is a black woman who occupies a post in a black middle-class district and who is elected at large on a citywide basis. End footnote. The prominence of the therapeutic outlook has helped legitimate these actions by divorcing them from political discussion, which is deemed inappropriate and insensitive, and locating them in the realm of clinical practice. The curfew, therefore, by definition, cannot violate juveniles' rights because it is enacted in their best interest and with the approval of professional expertise. Unlike the Soviet Union, however, where therapeutic subordination stems from the police, in this case there's the additional mediation of a narcissist cultural disposition. Thus, these increasingly diminished selves, which already are inclined to comprehend life as a quest for authenticity, can be mobilized to accept their personal subordination and therapeutic direction as the only valid mode for addressing any social phenomenon. The narcissist element in contemporary politics, as pluralism has eradicated the public good in the competition for narrowly self-interested groups, has been presented in the Atlanta situation in other ways as well. More concretely, the culture of narcissism has surfaced with homosexual political activism as a new power center, demanding that its interests be acknowledged in the murder investigations. After reports indicated that as many as 10 of the murdered boys may have shared a link to a homosexual house of prostitution, local homosexual political activists took affront at the implication, which had been just beneath the surface of much public discussion of the killings, that the murders may be sex-related, as in Chicago and Houston. Homosexual blocks insecurity about this issue has been exacerbated by the belief that gay activists see themselves on the verge of major advances in local political influence. This year, a gay activist candidate will most likely wage a serious contest for a city council seat in a district that has become a major center of Atlanta's gentrification. What is more, homosexual activism gradually has presented an increasingly unified and growing public posture, generally in city politics. The issue of juvenile homosexual prostitution in this context clearly becomes a vulnerable one for homosexual activism. Over the last several years, the, quote, chicken trade, end quote, has received considerable local publicity. What the hell does that mean? Not really saying anything for it. It seems like it makes sense here. Over the last several years, the, quote, chicken trade, end quote, has received considerable local publicity, as Atlanta remains a terminus for runaways from all of the Southeast, and as it has become, as local propagandists put it, the, quote, gay capital of the South, end quote. As homosexual activists strive for basic legitimacy and general coalition with leftist, black, and feminist groups, any identification of this bloc with pederasty could jeopardize the movement's short-term objectives. Still, no organic links actually exist between homosexual activism and other pluralist centers with which it seeks political links, beyond a very general statement on the right to individual sexual freedom, it is not clear what common agendas the movements share. Footnote. In this regard, the movement seems caught in an internal contradiction for which no adequate resolution may exist. Insofar as sexual preference is the connecting thread of homosexual activism, and the ultimate demand is not subjected to public judgment for one's sexual and therefore private preferences, then the appropriate orientation would appear to that extent, other than as one of an interchangeable array of private choices of all types for which public judgment is disallowable. Homosexuality appears as not properly a political issue at all. End footnote. Gentrification in Atlanta as elsewhere is an issue that separates homosexual activists from the poor, elderly, and other socially marginal groups with which to seek alliance. Moreover, except for the sexual freedom issues, much of the homosexual electorate tends towards the right rather than the left. Perhaps no issue here is more sensitive than juvenile prostitution, and hints of its implication in the murdered children cases immediately brought an instructive response from activists. In a press statement on the 8th of April 1981, a spokesperson for a coalition of local gay organizations, while acknowledging that children are driven to prostitution by economic considerations, proceeded with unconscionable cynicism to stand reason on its head, by arguing that the youthful homosexual prostitutes should not be seen as exploited children, but rather as masquerading heterosexual exploiters of older, quote, gays. The coalition went on to blast the police and news media for so much as alluding to possible homosexual connections on the ground that such reference constitutes discrimination, a position that indirectly indicates the public's private contradiction of homosexual activism. The charge was illustrated with a fatuous reference to the fact that the local media had not identified President Reagan's would-be assassin, John Hinckley Jr., as a heterosexual. A gay activist's hysterical reaction also uncovered the lingering tension between gays and the black community, given the fact that the poor, young black people's vulnerability has long constituted a human reservoir for urban, casually exploitable sex, both homosexual and heterosexual. Clearly, every major city in the United States has its areas where impoverished black juveniles congregate to participate in homosexual prostitution. Thus, if one were to construct a, quote, political economy of homosexuality, crude exploitation most likely would be found as a prominent aspect of the homosexual nexus in the black community. The reaction of Atlanta's gay activist coalition to the official suggestion of a homosexual link in the murder was entirely self-serving, and it suggested an opportunist subordination of collective concern with the police investigation to the requirements of homosexual pluralist agitation. Thus, the gay reaction imitates both the defensive response of the business community, which fears that the killer is white, and the opportunism of the left, which hopes to capitalize organizationally on the tragedy. Whatever else it may or may not have done, the Reagan administration, if only by the choice of symbols and images it has wrapped around itself, has conveyed to dormant racist and militant alt-rightists that their element is coming back, if not to power, at least to respectability. Klansmen, Nazis, and other such flotsam have been hardened by the apparent Klansmen, Nazis, and other such flotsam have been heartened by the apparent successes of the strategy advocated by Falwell and Helms and the radical right. In fact, they have been moved to take violent action, as the recent lynching of a black youth in Mobile, Alabama demonstrates. At the same time, Reagan's budget cuts, especially the CETA cuts, have accelerated the growing insecurity of poor communities. In this context, the Atlanta murders easily could be attributed to a grand white racist conspiracy. The ragtag groups of black and white leftists and surviving black nationalists, who are all too ready to speak for and organize residents of the affected communities, favor this line. Yet the conspiracy line cannot be supported by local political officials who are committed to avoiding inflammatory situations in the city and to maintaining a hidden repudiation of anyone who challenges it, the cover-up charge. This outlook offers yet another example of the opportunism and underdeveloped critical vision that characterizes the heirs of the New Left legacy. Both limitations were demonstrated clearly in a recent controversy over armed resident patrols in a housing project. A cadre of local activists went into the project located in the poorest area of the city to organize the frustrated residents by advocating armed vigilantism as a response to perceived ineffectiveness of police service to the area. Arrests were staged after posturing with guns that were later revealed to have been unloaded. Since the initial controversy, the area has been penetrated by a legion of baseless political groups that tail behind every minor expression of disaffection in the community, hoping to transform it into the basis for a mass movement. The Techwood Bat Patrol case, however, offers insights to the obsolete character of this orientation and the weaknesses it suffers as a result of its revolutionary mythology. The AI overview says, the Techwood Bat Patrol refers to a community-organized self-defense patrol formed by residents of Techwood Homes, a housing project in Atlanta during the Atlanta youth murders of 1981. The patrol was created to address the high crime rates and perceived lack of protection from the police. The, quote, Bat Patrol was a notable example of community-led self-defense in response to the ongoing murders of young black men in the city. Back to the text. The Techwood Bat Patrol case, however, offers insights to the obsolete character of this orientation and the weaknesses it suffers as a result of its revolutionary mythology. Confronted with a situation in which black constituents of a black regime elected with overwhelmingly popular black support were dissatisfied with their receipt of public service, the activists responded by urging these citizens to surrender their claims on the public service delivery process in favor of a self-help strategy of community self-defense. This posture recalls on the one hand, a period when blacks were unable to make claims on local public service allocations, and on the other, discloses a characteristic of the revolutionary mystique, an assumption that appropriate political action must totally repudiate current political and administrative agencies as inimical to the ends of total transformation. In this case, such posturing leads to the absurd situation in which radicals deny the propriety of demanding equitable delivery of public services. Ironically, not long after the controversy in Techwood Homes, the first victim was taken from that area. So thus is the circle completed. After all the machinations of leftist sects, homosexual activists, self-indulgent businessmen, therapeutic functionaries, would-be and actual politicos, and the others, the killer continues to punctuate the real tragedy, the total domination and helplessness that define clientage in organized capitalism. The end. Thanks for listening.